You know that feeling when you walk into your childhood home after years away and suddenly you're 8 years old again, standing in your mother's kitchen on a Saturday morning? That's what happens when you catch a whiff of fresh coffee brewing in a percolator, or hear the distant hum of a rotary phone dialing, or feel the rough texture of wood paneling under your fingertips. For millions of Canadians who grew up between the 1950s and the 1980s, these weren't just random sensory experiences. They were the soundtrack and scenery of a very particular way of being Canadian. Picture this. It's 1967, the year of Expo and the new flag, and you're 10 years old living in a bungalow in Mississauga or Burnaby or any of the hundreds of suburban neighborhoods sprouting across the country like dandelions after spring rain. Your morning starts with the smell of bacon frying in the kitchen, where your mother stands at the counter in her housecoat, waiting for the coffee to finish percolating. The radio plays a mix of American pop hits and CBC News, while outside your bedroom window, the sound of lawnmowers creates a gentle suburban symphony that will become the background music of your childhood memories. The kitchen was the nerve center of Canadian family life back then. Harvest Gold or avocado green appliances hummed quietly against wood grain cabinets, and the linoleum floor bore the scuff marks of thousands of hurried breakfasts and after-school snacks. Everyday meals happened around the kitchen table with its vinyl tablecloth, in the salt and pepper shakers that had been wedding gifts years earlier. The telephone hung on the wall, its long spiral cord stretched and twisted from years of conversations. When it rang, everyone in the house could hear it. There was no hiding, no screening calls. The phone rang, you answered it, and you dealt with whoever was on the other end. If you lived in this world, your father probably worked downtown and took the bus or drove his Chevy or Ford to the office every morning at 8 sharp. He wore a tie every day, even on Saturdays when he was just running errands, and he read the newspaper at breakfast while your mother packed his lunch in a brown paper bag. Your mother might have worked too, but for many families it was part-time, something that fit around the school schedule and family needs. The idea that both parents would work full-time and rely on daycare existed, but it was still unusual enough that neighbors would comment on it. School meant walking several blocks each way, often with the same group of kids who lived on your street. You carried your books in your arms or a simple canvas bag, and you knew which houses had the friendliest dogs and which ones you crossed the street to avoid. The crossing guard knew your name and asked about your family. Your teacher lived somewhere in your neighborhood, so you'd occasionally spot her at the grocery store on weekends, which always felt slightly surreal, like seeing a character from another world out of context. Winter defined everything about Canadian childhood during these decades, not just the obvious things like hockey and snow forts, but the way snow changed the entire rhythm of daily life. The sound of snow tires crunching on fresh powder at 6 in the morning as your neighbor left for work. The particular quality of light filtering through frost-covered windows. The way your mother would layer sweaters, scarves, and mittens on you before you went outside, creating a ritual of preparation that could easily take 15 minutes. You'd stand by the door, getting progressively warmer and more impatient, while she hunted for your other mitten or decided you needed an extra pair of socks. The cold air had its own smell, sharp and clean, mixed with the scent of wood smoke from fireplaces and exhaust from cars warming up into driveways. Indoor heating systems worked overtime, filling houses with dry, artificially warmed air that made static electricity jump from your fingertips when you touched doorknobs. Windows fogged up from the temperature difference, and you'd draw pictures in the condensation while watching for the school bus through the haze. Saturday mornings meant something completely different then. In the 60s and 70s, you might wake up to the sound of vacuum cleaners and the smell of cleaning products as your mother tackled the weekly housework. Your father might be in the basement workshop, the scent of wood shavings and oil drifting upstairs, or outside washing the car in the driveway, even in questionable weather. The television offered a limited but treasured selection of children's programming, and you'd position yourself on the living room carpet, close enough to the set to adjust the rabbit ears when the picture got fuzzy. The living room was formal territory. The good furniture lived there, along with the fancy lamp that was never to be touched, and the coffee table that held the current issue of Chatelaine or Maclean's. The television sat in the corner like a piece of furniture itself, a substantial wooden cabinet housing a relatively small screen. Changing channels meant getting up and walking over to turn a dial, and there were only a handful of options anyway. By the 1970s, shag carpet was everywhere, thick and luxurious under bare feet, but impossible to keep clean. It captured everything: crumbs, pet hair, small toys that would disappear into its depths only to resurface months later during a serious vacuuming. The colors were bold and unapologetic: burnt orange, avocado green, chocolate brown. These weren't tentative design choices. They were statements about optimism and the future. Sunday meant church for many families, followed by a big dinner that filled the house with the competing aromas of roast beef, Yorkshire pudding, and vegetables that had been cooking for what felt like hours. Afternoons stretched long and lazy, punctuated by visits from relatives who'd arrive unannounced, confident they'd be welcomed. Adults would gather in the kitchen for coffee and conversation while children were sent outside to play, regardless of the weather. The concept of structured activities or scheduled play dates didn't exist. You simply opened the door and found something to do. Corner stores anchored every neighborhood. Small independent shops run by families who knew their customers by name. The proprietor stood behind the counter, making change from a cash register that rang with authority when the drawer popped open. Penny candy lived in glass jars in the earlier years, and if you grew up in the 60s or early 70s, you might remember trying to stretch a handful of coins into the maximum possible sweetness. The store smelled like newspapers, penny candy, and the coffee that was always brewing for the adults. By the 80s, the prices had crept up, and the jars looked a bit different. But the ritual of standing there, choosing carefully, stayed the same. Outside, the phone booth stood like a little glass embassy. Inside, the metal receiver hung heavy in your hand while you fed coins into the slot and listened to the clatter as they dropped. Long-distance calls were special occasions that required planning and permission. You didn't just phone someone because you felt like it. You checked the time zone, you watched the clock, you counted the cost in your head. Evening entertainment centered around the television set. Families gathered to watch whatever was on the 3 or 4 available channels. Hockey night in Canada commanded Saturday nights with an authority that was nearly religious. Whether you were watching in black and white in the 60s or in full color by the 80s, the cadence of the play-by-play became part of the Canadian winter soundscape. Even people who didn't particularly care about hockey might have the game on in the background while they folded laundry or read the paper. The smell of popcorn would fill the living room as someone tried to catch kernels in an air popper or heated oil in a covered pot on the stove. There was an art to timing it perfectly, listening for the moment when the popping slowed down just enough. Television watching was communal. You negotiated with siblings and parents about what to watch, and changing the channel required either getting up or convincing someone else to do it for you. Summer brought an entirely different rhythm. The smell of charcoal lighter fluid and barbecue smoke drifted through neighborhoods on warm evenings, mixed with the sound of sprinklers hitting sidewalks and children playing games that lasted until parents called them in for bed. Screen doors slammed constantly as people moved between indoor and outdoor spaces, and the jingle of the ice cream truck created momentary neighborhood emergencies as children scrambled to find coins and catch the vendor before he turned the corner. Camping was democracy in action. Families piled into station wagons loaded with canvas tents, Coleman stoves, and coolers full of food that somehow stayed fresh enough. The smell of campfire smoke and bug spray became the perfume of summer freedom, and everyone relearned how to live with less, how to find entertainment in skipping stones and poking at the fire with a stick. These weren't luxury vacations. They were simple, shared experiences that stuck in your memory far more than the details of any hotel ever would. Music filled the spaces between all of this. On AM radio in the 60s and the early 70s, you heard a mix of international hits and emerging Canadian voices. Gordon Lightfoot, Guess Who, Anne Murray. You'd wait through songs you didn't like to hear the ones you did. The arrival of FM radio in the 70s and the early 80s opened up new sonic territory. Longer songs, deeper album cuts, late-night DJs who sounded impossibly cool and a little mysterious. You'd fall asleep with a transistor radio under your pillow, the volume turned down just low enough to avoid parental detection. A school day in 1980s Canada as a teen. If you were a teenager in the 1980s, your Canada felt a little different from your parents' version. Your alarm clock was probably digital instead of wind-up, glowing red numbers in the dark. You might have a ghetto blaster on your dresser, or a cheap clock radio that snapped onto CFNY, Chum FM, or whatever your local station was, blasting out Rush, Bryan Adams, or Platinum Blonde before your eyes were even fully open. Your school bag was stuffed with duotongues, Hilroy notebooks, and maybe, if you were lucky, a Walkman with a mixtape somebody made you. You'd head out the door in a denim jacket, or a ski parka with a band logo drawn on the back in ballpoint pen. The bus stop was its own little social universe. Kids huddled in parkas in winter, everyone trying to look cool and not slip on the ice. The school itself had its own smell, a mix of floor wax, chalk dust, wet boots, and cafeteria fries. Lockers slammed like a drumline between classes. Your locker door might be covered in magazine clippings, band stickers, and maybe a carefully hidden photo of your crush. Communication was analog, but constant. Folded notes passed hand to hand, messages scribbled on binder covers, code words that only your friend group understood. At lunch, the cafeteria sold those unforgettable fries and gravy, cardboard trays balanced on plastic orange or brown chairs. If your school was near a plaza, there'd be at least one kid who sprinted to Zellers, Woolco, or the corner store to grab chips and a chocolate bar instead. Some days you'd flip through a consumer's distributing catalogs in the library, circling cassette decks and stereos you couldn't afford yet. Around Christmas, the Sears Wishbook felt like sacred scripture. You and your siblings would fight over who got to look at the toy pages first. After school, if it wasn't straight home, there were 3 big destinations: the malls, the arcade, or band practice in someone's basement. Malls were social ecosystems: fair weather for clothes, Kohl's for books, Zellers or Eaton's as the anchor stores. The smell of fries, perfume, and new vinyl records mixed together. Arcades glowed in the dark corners of pizza shops and malls, all bleeps and flashing lights, pockets heavy with quarters. You'd lean over a cabinet, trying to beat your high score, while Take On Me, or Summer of '69, crackled from a ceiling speaker. School dances were their own kind of magic. The gym, usually echoing with dodgeballs and squeaky sneakers, turned into a low-lit universe of colored spotlights and slow songs. That moment when your crush actually asked you to dance to a Rod Stewart ballad or a Phil Collins track is still sitting somewhere in the back of your mind, as vivid as ever. For a few minutes, under the mirror ball, the entire world shrank to that tiny circle of polished gym floor. Then, of course, you'd go home, turn on much music, and hope they played your favorite video while you tried to study. It was a different kind of Canadian childhood, but it was still built on the same quiet certainties: school, family, friends, and the feeling that tomorrow would more or less make sense. Shopping, through all these decades, was an event, not a reflex. Downtown department stores like Eaton's, Simpson's, or the Bay felt almost ceremonial. At Christmas, their windows turned into animated fairy tales, drawing families to the sidewalk in mittened crowds. Elevators had operators. The toy department was a kingdom, especially when the Sears or Eaton's Christmas catalog, the Wishbook, showed up at home and set off sibling negotiations and arguments. By the 70s and 80s, suburban plazas and malls started to reshape that experience. Zellers with its Club Z points and in-store restaurant, Woolco's wide aisles, Byway's bargain bins, Consumers Distributing's mysterious catalog counter, where toys and stereos appeared from the back like magic. Canadian stores even had their own distinct smells. People still talk about how no place smells quite like a Canadian Tire, or a Grand and Toy did back then. Customer service meant actual conversations. Clerks knew their departments and sometimes recognized you. They'd tell you when the next sale was coming, put something aside, or help you find a size without checking a screen. Transactions were mostly cash. Checks were serious business. Credit cards were present, but they hadn't yet become a way of life. Holiday traditions carried a weight that went far beyond presents. Christmas preparations began in earnest after Halloween. Baking in November, shortbread and gingerbread in tins, fruitcake wrapped in wax paper, lights untangled and tested one by one. Real trees stood in living rooms, drinking water from metal stands and shedding needles everywhere. Gift-giving was modest but personal. The wrapping paper was often saved, folded, and reused. Someone always ended up with socks and was quietly grateful. Canadian winters demanded a particular kind of resilience and creativity. When the temperature dropped below -20, you learned to dress in layers and move quickly between heated spaces. Snowstorms created instant community projects. Everyone out with shovels, snowblowers roaring, neighbors helping each other dig out. But winter also brought unique pleasures. The sound of skates on an outdoor rink under yellow streetlights, the taste of hot chocolate after hours of play, snow days that transformed ordinary weekdays into unexpected holidays. Hockey wasn't just a sport, it was a social language. Local arenas filled with the sound of parents cheering, coaches shouting instructions, and skates carving lines in fresh ice. Equipment bags crowded tiny dressing rooms. Coffee in styrofoam cups steamed in the cold air. Many kids didn't go on to serious leagues, but they did gain something else. Car rides, home in the dark, talking to a tired parent about nothing and everything. The pace of information was fundamentally different. News arrived at scheduled times, on the 6 o'clock broadcast, the late-night national news, or the morning paper. You might not learn about major events until hours or days after they happened. That delay created a kind of mental breathing room that's hard to imagine now. Arguments weren't settled by pulling out a phone. They simmered, resurfaced, and sometimes turned into trips to the library. Neighborhoods had recognizable rhythms. Mail came at predictable times, delivered by postal workers who walked their routes and knew which houses had friendly dogs and which ones required caution. Garbage and recycling, when it started, followed solid schedules. Streetlights flickered on at dusk like a national reminder. Kids, time to wrap it up and head home. Life was more tactile, more physical. Maps were folded paper puzzles. Photographs lived in albums with plastic sleeves or in shoeboxes under beds, their edges softened by handling. Music came on vinyl or cassette With album art, you actually studied. Books showed their age, creased spines, dog-eared corners, library due date stamps. Small rituals anchored the days, morning coffee at the same place on the counter, the evening news at 6, the weekly grocery run, the aimless Sunday drive, just to see where the road goes. None of these were dramatic, but together they created a structure, a sense that time was moving forward in an understandable way. Technology existed, of course, but it didn't dominate. Television programming often ended at midnight with the national anthem and a test pattern. Telephones were attached to walls. If you wanted privacy, you stretched the cord down the hallway and hoped nobody needed to pass. Cars were machines that many people could still repair themselves in their driveways, with the help of a Chilton manual and a patient neighbor. Medical care often revolved around a family doctor who knew multiple generations of the same family. Nurses and staff at local hospitals might also be neighbors or fellow parishioners at church. The introduction and expansion of universal health care in the 1960s and beyond represented a collective decision that health wasn't just an individual responsibility, but a shared one. Education emphasized discipline and conformity, but it also represented possibility. Teachers commanded a certain respect that followed them outside the classroom. Parent-teacher nights felt serious. School gyms became community centers for concerts, bake sales, Christmas pageants, and of course, those unforgettable dances. Growing up in Canada between the 1950s and 1980s left deep marks on how people think about community, privacy, and responsibility. These weren't perfect decades, far from it. There were economic downturns, political conflicts, social injustices that were ignored or only partially addressed. Nostalgia can soften the sharp edges. But even with all of that, many people remember a certain underlying stability, a slower pace, a feeling that life, for the most part, made sense. Looking back now, those years feel like a distinct chapter with its own logic and rhythms. The smells of percolated coffee and fresh mimeograph paper, the clunk of a rotary dial, the warmth of a crowded living room on a winter night, these have become trigger points for entire worlds of memory. Nobody knew at the time which moments would last. The small rituals and daily habits that seemed ordinary then are the treasures now. Somehow, for a lot of people, it all felt enough. So as we close this chapter of the Canadian Time Capsule, let me ask you this. What's the one small, ordinary detail you remember most from growing up in that Canada? Was it a particular store you loved? The smell of your local mall? The sound of your high school hallway? Or maybe the feeling of that first slow dance in a dimly lit gym? Tell your story in the comments. Because when we put these tiny pieces together, we don't just remember a country, we remember the way it felt to call it home.